This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm David McDonald.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And this week we are joined by Philip Rothman of NYC Music Services and Sibelius blog. Philip is, of course, one of the foremost experts on using Sibelius and also Finale in professional engraving of all kinds. He does Sibelius trainings and has taken over Sibelius blog from one of our previous guests, Daniel Spreadbury, for the last 3 years or so, and we're really pleased to have him. Thanks for being on the show, Philip.
Pleasure to be with you, Dave and Sam. Happy to be here.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to speak with you in particular this morning is that there's been obviously a new version of Sibelius released, and it's gotten some, I'm going to go with interesting reviews from current Sibelius users. And also, you recently spoke with one of the founders of Sibelius software, Ben Finn. So let's start with that, kind of going chronologically. Had you spoken with either Ben or Jonathan Finn before?
Interestingly enough, technically yes. About 15 years ago, I was a grad student at Juilliard, and Ben came to New York and gave a demo of what must have been Sibelius 1.0 or thereabouts to several of us that were, interested in it. And so I had met him then, but I'm sure he didn't necessarily remember that particular meeting, although he did remember the presentation because we spoke about it, recently. So technically we had spoken before, but since that time, no. I mean, I hadn't been in touch with him at all, and I was delighted that he was interested in basically, talking about the state of the industries, talking about the early days of Sibelius, and I got the idea actually. I don't know if you know this book. Steve Jobs' biographer, Walter Isaacson, and he has this new book that came out fairly recently called The Innovators, and he was talking about the early days of the computer industry and all these stories, and then kind of the aftermath of what had happened with these different products, going way back to the early computers that were taking up a whole room, down to microprocessors and all that. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be interesting to kind of get the story of the early days of Sibelius and going to the present day, and so that was kind of the spirit in which I approached it. No, it was a good talk.
Well, it's a fascinating read, and we'll have links to it in our show notes at soundnotion.tv for anyone listening to this that wants to catch up and read the whole thing. The thing that interested me, that really grabbed my attention right off the bat, I've been reading some computer histories lately anyway, because I'm a nerd, but the story of Sibelius starting on this really quirky niche platform. And I remember, because I've been, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, I've been a Sibelius user for a super long time, and I remember reading about Sibelius on Acorn computers. But Acorn computer didn't mean anything to me, and so it kind of just was jettisoned into the pile of information that I don't need in my brain. And reading about this, I had no idea that was... So the Acorn computer, I guess, was kind of like a TRS-80 kind of level computer system. It didn't do a ton, and this is in a day when operating systems hadn't been quite as standardized as they are today, where we've got all people using more or less 2 operating systems today. There were dozens of these things, and I had no idea. And this was a particularly British thing to have.
Well, yes. Well, I think the computer itself was actually quite powerful, from what I understand, having talked not only with Ben but quite a number of other people that lived in the UK when it was really quite prevalent. And as Ben mentioned, there was a BBC documentary that was made about how to use computers, and there was a special model that, as I understand, was actually made as the kind of flagship BBC computer that was used in this in this documentary for people to learn how to use computers. So it was quite, as I understand it, it was quite prevalent in the UK and I think some of the Commonwealth countries. And from talking to people that actually used it, they said, it was actually quite fast. As Ben mentions, Sibelius was written in assembly language, so that made it work quite fast as well. And but you or I may not have heard of it being here in the United States because it was all but non-existent. He said they did manage to actually sell a few copies to some early adopters here, but it was
like a
interesting.
package, right? They were like selling the computer and software and hardware in a package.
That's right, and I think the closest analogy that I can think of, based on what I understand of the early days of music notation software, was David Pogue actually performed kind of a similar role with Finale. And he didn't invent the software, but he was educating his colleagues on how to use not just the software, but also a computer in general, how to use the mouse, how to use a keyboard, because it was so new. And it was the same thing with Ben and Jonathan. From what I understand, they were really, because this is the first, the fact that it was an Acorn as opposed to a PC or a Mac really didn't much matter to people. They didn't know from any of it. So,
right.
They just wanted something that they could compose on and print their music out. And so there was a lot in that day of not just, the things that we take for granted, like, kids that are, essentially it's inborn. They know how to use all these things like tablets and mice and keyboards. There was a real learning curve at that level as well. So that was part of it.
And this was super early days of computing. There weren't a lot of big giant companies that were doing these sorts of things, which is pretty exciting that these two guys who were brothers and could just work on this thing on their own. And another thing that surprised me was how long they were working on it before they got to a release point. They were working on it for something like 7 years or something like that.
Right. They had started in high school, and they were part of that generation in the 1980s that really started getting into computer software. And as they mentioned, they were getting into composing as well, which was really quite unusual at that time. Certainly composing is much more of the curriculum these days, both there and over here. But I remember even when I was a high school student, it was and pursuing composing, and maybe it was the same with you as well. It was pretty unusual. I mean, you had your band program, you had your orchestra program, and your chorus. But a composing thing was kind of unusual, and to take an interest in that was something. But there was Finale, there was Score, certainly, which was the first computer program, and they were marketed there to a certain extent. And of course, here people were using Finale quite a bit. And there were some other things I remember. I can't remember the name of some of them off the top of my head, but I remember playing with a couple of different early music notation programs. But one of the things that I have tremendous respect for, and still do, really, I mean, to try to put together a music notation software package is, I mean, just think about all the complex interactions of notes and rhythms and expressions and layout, etc., not to mention the playback thing. And the extraordinary thing is that people did it and continue to do it, and it's really quite fascinating. But it was interesting that he said they were vaguely aware of Finale, vaguely aware of Score, but they basically invented it as they would like to use the software, and not necessarily based on a competitor's product, because back then, the internet was in its infancy. You couldn't really share these things very quickly, and so there wasn't quite the same level of instant knowledge that there is today.
Yeah, and figuring out a way to get a computer to align everything correctly. There's so many little fiddly contingencies, and even today, 20 years into the development of the software package, there are still things that it doesn't get right, but that it comes as close as it does on the first try is really astonishing.
It is.
And writing in that low-level assembly language is really interesting. For those that aren't geeky, assembly is like really close to like telling the computer what thing to turn to a 1 and what thing to turn to a 0. It's what the geeks call close to the metal. It's very it's like one step above writing ones and zeros for the computer. So like to do this huge thing in assembly is really stunning. And there's a funny story that that Ben told you about that I want to relay. You had some great audio clips in this article, and so I want to play this little clip about the first time they ever connected a printer to the Sibelius workstation that they were working on, because obviously that's like a whole separate problem, right? Once you've figured out how to get the computer to put all the notes and the accidentals and the rest and the meters and everything in the right places, you then have to figure out how to translate all of that information to a piece of hardware that's going to put ink on a page and be able to hand it to somebody. And at the time, those things were not cheap. And so this is a story. This is Ben telling our guest Philip Rothman about the first time they used a real printer.
I remember the very first printout we ever did of Sibelius, which was actually quite close to release because we couldn't afford a laser printer. These are the days. This is when, like an Apple Laserite. We had to have a PostScript laser printer, and an Apple Laserite or something cost something like $2,000. We couldn't afford, so we hired one for a day, and stayed up all night trying to. Because we'd written all the code throughout the PostScript, like we'd written our own driver, PostScript driver, written all the code, and of course PostScript is a whole programming language itself, so like that had bugs in it, so like it wouldn't output until you'd fixed all the bugs. So we stayed up all night, and then like 6 in the morning, out popped a page, which miraculously was almost perfect notation and engraving. See, it was only months away from release, and this was the first time we'd actually had a printout. And we kept this this was so astonishing, that it just popped out perfect. We both signed it and like wrote the date and time on it. But then we seem to have lost it, which is a real shame.
That little piece of history is lost, but it's a fun story, and it's amazing that they went, most of the 7 years of development without ever printing a sheet of paper, just because the printer was too expensive.
Right.
Like that idea is astonishing. I remember when my brother went to college, my little brother went to college, printers were so cheap that he would just get an inkjet printer and use it until the cartridge that it came with ran out, and then buy a new printer because it was cheaper than buying a cartridge. So like those kinds of changes over the last 15 to 20 years of computing are the really exciting things. And he mentions also in here the way that computers change in ways you don't anticipate. And we can play a clip of him talking about those things as well. But I want to kind of shift gears to the modern Sibelius. And obviously, eventually they developed Mac and Windows versions of the software and developed a huge market share. I didn't realize that, and he mentions this in this interview, that at the time that they sold Sibelius to Avid, they estimated that they had about 50% market share to Finale's 40%, which I would not have guessed.
Me neither.
And that was shortly after Sibelius 4 released, right?
That's right. Yeah, that was in 2006. And it may be, again, because here in the U.S. we were not as early adopters of Sibelius as perhaps some of the other countries, certainly the U.K., and they had certainly a big presence, I think, very early on in, it was either Australia or New Zealand or perhaps both. He said they had a very good distributor down there that got them really going. So it may be in certain pockets here in the United States that you had people using Sibelius, but then certainly I think closer to Make Music's home base at the time, which was in Minnesota. I mean, really, you had just everybody was using Finale or thereabouts. But I do remember, fairly soon after seeing that demo for the first time in, I think it was either 99 or 2000, that you did start seeing people really fairly soon adopt Sibelius, and so I was certainly aware of it, but I didn't actually start using Sibelius until Sibelius 4 myself. So I think that perception, Dave, is quite right in that we didn't think that it was half the market, but perhaps when you take the overall worldwide global market, especially in education and some of the other places where adoption was quite rapid, as opposed to, say, people that had been composing and using Finale for a while and really weren't used to anything else. Then I have no, certainly he would know better than I would in terms of what their market share was, so I have no reason to doubt those figures.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up education, because I think that's probably the thing that drove a lot of that, is that it wasn't people who were switching from Finale to Sibelius, but it was a lot of institutions in particular who were buying their first music engraving package, and that was Sibelius for a lot of those institutional buyers, and I think that probably drove a lot of that number. And you mentioned seeing that demo, and that demo, I think, and he mentions this a little bit, is one of kind of the early guiding principles of Sibelius development. And this is the thing that set it apart from Finale and other engraving packages, but that you could just click a thing and drag it, and that's how you moved it.
Right.
That distinction between Sibelius and Finale blew my mind when I first saw it, and that's the thing that caused me to jump into Sibelius early on.
Right. Yeah, and he mentions clicking the clef and dragging it around for hours of harmless enjoyment.
Right,
I don't know if...
And you mean like dragging it left and right, because you see the notes like pop as soon as you go to the one side of the note, it'll move the note to the right liner space for that clef.
That's right, left or right, or up and down for that matter. You can drag a clef among different staves, and it will respect that as well. Yeah, and that was something that not being tool-based like Finale was, the fact that you had a much more direct interaction with the music, and people, it's funny, now we have things like Staff Pad and Notate Me and some of these other things where you really are literally writing on the screen, but at that time people were saying it's as close to writing music by hand as you can get on a computer, because that's all we knew of at that time. But yeah, and going back to your earlier part about the education and the market share, don't forget, I mean, and you see that photograph of them in, I think it was 2005, where they had, I think he said about 80 people working worldwide for Sibelius Limited. The actual company was a standalone company, and there were people that were really going in and aggressively marketing, proselytizing about the software. To the extent that you just don't see today. And Finale had that as well. Make Music, Coda, and later Make Music had that as well. But there wasn't quite the saturation that there is now, and I think that was part of what they were doing. But yeah, it was kind of mind blowing to see some of those things happen in real time. And what he said was that basically, yes, that was on the surface, it looked really cool, but it also showed you that underneath there were some really powerful things that were going on in the program. Like the program was really interpreting what you were doing in real time, and I think that was very important to how they wanted to perceive. Wanted the user to perceive how it was working. They didn't want you to necessarily think, do you have to go into this tool or that tool to choose the right transposition or whatever. It just does it. And that, of course, was one of the early knocks against Sibelius, and there were these, it was much more passionate back in the day. People were really defending their own, defending one or the other. It was like today's Congress almost, with just the political debates. And but they were saying, Finale, you can do so much more. It gets so infinitely tweakable. And Sibelius, it won't allow you to do anything other than the program's defaults. And those were very simple distillations of what the programs could do, because obviously Finale had defaults that were, okay, reasonably okay, and Sibelius had, arguably better defaults, and of course Sibelius, you could also tweak a lot of stuff in Sibelius as well. So, but that's where kind of the arguments were coming from, and of course over time, I think the competition was good for both programs in that. They did start adopting features of one or the other, and both Sibelius got more tweakable, Finale got more user-friendly, and certainly that was helpful.
Yeah, my upbringing as an undergraduate was with Finale because my undergraduate composition teacher was a computer nerd, and Finale was available sooner, and it was a United States thing. And it's interesting, we're sort of talking about this arms race, and in my research, I mean, there's a lot of things I didn't really realize about how this went. Like, Finale came out in 1988 in some version, but not for a Mac until 2004. And
no, that's not.
Wait a minute, did I get that wrong? When is? Well.
Yeah, I think you might be thinking of the OS 10 version, which didn't come out until 2004. But no, Finale was, I believe, it was actually a Mac version first. We'll have to double check that.
Okay.
But they were both. Yeah, they were both. It was for both platforms really quite early on. But I think you're thinking of the OS 10 when they moved from Classic to OS 10 in 2004.
Okay, but Sibelius basically existed at the very beginning as selling you a computer and a way to use that computer to do engraving, and not now. Correct me if I'm wrong. Not till 1998 was there a PC version, and followed shortly thereafter in 1999 by a Mac version. That's correct, right?
That is correct. That's right.
And it's interesting that I've always had this sort of impression of this arms race between the two, but never really knew that much about it. Did the companies was there animosity, do you think, that went back and forth between, is there a TV series, Halt and Engrave Fire to be made out of this, or is it more mundane than people imagine that it might be?
I wouldn't really be able to speak to that, certainly at that time. I didn't know anybody that was working with either of those companies. I was a student or maybe just had recently graduated. And started using the software professionally. So, I still am. I'm at the end of the day, I'm a user, I'm a composer, arranger, copyist, just like you guys. And but I know that we would have these discussions just like we're having now, geeking out with my friends and colleagues about everything from what the latest compositions were to what composers were doing what to styles to Finale and Sibelius and the tools that we were using and Mac versus PC, and it was all those things. I mean, you would see those things in real-time discussions. You'd see them on forums, on chat rooms, and that sort of thing where people. It was the same sort of idea. People who are listening may not necessarily know Finale or Sibelius, but you know the larger Mac versus PC wars that were going on at the time, and it's the same. I mean, it's like Coke versus Pepsi or Finale versus Sibelius. It was that people had a real allegiance to it, and I think because I think because composing is very personal, and as I said in the review of Sibelius 8, that many of us spend more time with this notation software than we do with any human being. I'm sad to say, but it's just, I mean, it's our work, it's our life, it's our passion, and I think that is what manifests itself in the passion for the software. I don't think on an abstract level people really care so much about defending Finale or Sibelius. It's more like, this is how I compose, and this is what's so meaningful to me, and conflated with that is are these programs, and so we get to know their quirks, their personalities, their hiccups and strengths and all that. And that probably at the end of the day is what's driving this intense conversation.
Well, and I also think that there's a lot more kind of personal, emotional investment from Sibelius users than Finale users because of a kind of an underdog complex that we had for so long. And I think this is very similar to the Mac thing, is that Mac users are much more zealous about their operating system choices than Windows users are historically. Obviously, this has chilled a lot,
Right.
but because they were the smaller thing, that they felt like that might go away, especially with the Mac. Like there was a moment where the Mac thought it looked very, not great for Apple computer for a while.
And then they put one in colored plastic. Yeah.
Right. Well, sure.
Yeah.
But then while Sibelius was never in quite those dire straits, it was still the new upstart thing, and I think for that reason people felt particularly emotional about it.
Well, that's why the market share factoid we got was so surprising, because to me,
Right.
Sibelius always seemed like the underdog, just based on my own admittedly fairly limited experience. But it's understandable that people get so emotional. If I don't have this pencil, this variety of pencil with this millimeter of lead, I get all, I can't write music without it. And this is a very simple tool, and
Right.
it's easy to see how people would get that way about software. However,
who designed it.
yeah, as educators, I have discovered that it's best that you just start trying to learn how to use both. And
I want to fast forward actually.
but I'm telling you,
Sorry.
seeing my students who have some super duper hardcore Sibelius kung fu go crazy on it, I'm like, okay, that actually works pretty good. You can go really fast in Sibelius. I would actually like to see an engrave off between like people who proclaim to be the biggest hot rod on each system, and see who can copy something the fastest.
I'm sure that's been done. I know it's been done with Max and PD, Max and Pure Data, a couple of music applications that are similar to one another. Similar.
I'm sure it'll be a top reality show on.
That would be the greatest, most boring reality show. I would love it. I would.
They
watch
would
every
get
second.
dozens of viewers.
Right.
Dozens.
I would like to fast forward in this conversation to the sale of Sibelius to Avid, and that happened as we mentioned shortly after Sibelius 4, in the mid 2000s, which that decade we still don't have a good name for, but that was a moment for Jonathan and Ben Finn to step away from their duties at Sibelius entirely. And most of the other people, though, stayed and just became employees of Avid as opposed to employees of Sibelius Software Limited. And was your impression talking to Ben that a lot of things changed at that moment, or was it just kind of a slow, gradual thing after that?
From what he described, they had big plans with Avid. They were very excited about it. They felt that it was the best fit that they could find for a buyer for Sibelius, because there were certain things that they just couldn't go any further with in terms of penetration into some markets that Avid could bring them into that they weren't in. Certainly in the sequencing side of things, they were thinking, how can we build a sequencer that would be useful for the education market? And obviously they didn't really know much about that. Of course, Avid did. Avid, it seemed like a good fit for them because Sibelius had huge inroads into the education marketplace, and Avid was really, and still is really a consumer and professional level company. And so there were a lot of exciting plans, certainly, that I think that they had. Certainly, if you look at the early days of what was touted, it was very exciting, and I don't think anybody really thought anything otherwise. So, and he obviously said this was all done with the complete buy-in and involvement of the senior management team at Sibelius. So it wasn't like they just said, okay, one day, hey guys, we're selling to Avid and that's it. It was something that they really thought was going to take the software and that what would now be a division of Avid to the next level. And I think what happened is you saw really, not so long thereafter, you saw, obviously, we had just a general worldwide global economic crisis in starting late 2007, 2008. You had the rapid adoption of technology where people could start editing video fairly well on their home computers, as opposed to having to use Avid's proprietary hardware and software solutions. And so I think probably those two things contributed to a large extent to what was happening at Avid. But it was interesting, if we were to fast forward to when, so I think Avid basically started letting go people gradually, but then it didn't really come into the public consciousness until they said we're going to be getting rid of all the developers in the Finsbury Park office and basically letting go of our M Audio line and some other things. And I think what basically happened was you had a situation where Sibelius was really doing quite well on its own, and it's interesting because people, you probably heard a lot of the rumors and a lot of the hearsay. People might just grab a glimpse of the news or whatever, and they think, oh, Sibelius is going out of business, or Sibelius is going belly up, or it's not profitable, or it's there's no market for it. And from by all accounts, Sibelius was actually doing quite fine if you look at it on its own in terms of the revenue that it was generating versus the cost that it took to make it. And one of the more interesting things I think that Ben said in the interview is that from day one, Sibelius has always been profitable. It's never made a loss. And it's hard for us to think about that, and we think, oh, our esoteric world of music composition and the perception that it's not a money-making thing, but obviously, I mean, they built it into a company that they were able to sell for $23 million, and of which they netted $16 million. And he said, as far as he knew, Sibelius continued right on being profitable after that. So it was really more of a we think was a short-term cost-cutting move on Avid's part to really, the software was still at a very good point, and they basically eliminated another cost center, and they were able to get more profit out of it. Is the general, analysis of why they did what they did. But yeah, it's everybody was asking me, oh, Sibelius is going out of business and all these things, but that wasn't really quite accurate. In fact, not at all accurate. Almost quite the opposite.
Yeah, and so the impression from that Ben had was that Sibelius was kind of subsidizing losses from Avid's Media Composer and Pro Tools stuff.
In a way, yes. I think it is probably the case that Sibelius is still a much smaller element of Avid's total overall enterprises. Certainly, I mean, the music notation software is still a small player, but it's as its own thing. I think it was, when you look at the cost versus what it was generating in revenue, it was doing quite fine on its own. So I think it was the other parts of the company that were not doing so well.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see now that Finale has maintained some level of independence, and it is still the big major product at its company. And how that development is a little bit different than Sibelius, which is now a small part of a much larger company. And for me, I think like the first things that I remember noticing changing were just the way the licensing stuff happened, and how it seemed really clear that Avid didn't really understand how doing what I do is so much different than doing what a Pro Tools professional or a Media Composer professional does, just with regard to simple things like licensing. Because while I'm sure most of the development stayed relatively the same for the next few versions, it was the licensing stuff from the purchasing perspective that had to change with the new ownership, and then that had a radical, table flip moment this past version. Is there anything that you've felt particularly interested that we haven't talked about yet from your conversation with Ben Finn?
From that conversation, not particularly. Other than I received a lot of nice comments, both privately and publicly, from people that were very much involved with the earlier days, and it brought back a lot of nostalgia for them, and a lot of corroborating stories. Quite honestly, I just had dinner with someone the other night who is a British. Librarian, music librarian, and what he was saying was all very similar to what Ben was telling me about. They actually went to his house and delivered the product, and he used it on an Acorn initially, and he was using Finale at first. So it was just, I think a lot of people were reminiscing and appreciative of their efforts, and it really, I mean, they basically created this very early on and built it into something very substantial that really hundreds of thousands of people use to create music.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you mentioned the feedback that you've gotten. Obviously, I don't see any emails, but I can look at the comments on these posts on Sibelius blog, and the names of the people in those posts are people that I remember interacting with in the very early days of Sibelius. It was a relatively tight-knit community on the really terrible forum software that was set up and has remained almost completely unchanged since I started using it. Well, I don't know how long ago, but the names of the people that are there are people that I remember helping me figure things out in Sibelius when I was first starting to use it 15 years ago. They're the same names and the same people that are developing plugins, and the people that are like you running these independent kind of training sessions. Like all of that stuff is really interesting to me, and I think it's something that Avid has kind of killed. That pains me the most is that there's so much less community now, and I think a lot of that started when they let go the developers.
That's a good point, and I think it does speak to the accumulated knowledge not only of users but certainly of employees and developers. It's not something that you can just recreate overnight, replace one group with another or all that. I mean, cumulatively, you're talking about really centuries of knowledge of years put into the program when you count not only the development staff but the other people that were involved with making decisions and beta testers and user feedback. And it's quite honestly, it's the same with Make Music, with Finale. There are people that have been around a long time that know really can tell you 10 versions 15 versions back when a certain feature was implemented and why it was done that way. Certainly the same with even like MuseScore and Score, to the extent that it's still around. There is certainly the people that used MuseScore from its very early days are still very much involved with developing that program. So it's very hard to replace that type of knowledge quickly.
Well, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that since the development team changed, there have not been a lot of major changes to the application. The last big change to the application was with Sibelius 7, and that was the last one released by that original team. And since then, the changes have been incremental at best. And this is something that Ben brings up a couple of times in the interview, is he refers to that development team as some of the foremost experts in the world at creating this kind of software. Because as we've said, it's not necessarily intuitive. It's very difficult. There's a lot of very minor details that make very big differences, and that's one of the reasons that I think so many people are so excited about the possibility of a third option from Steinberg, created by these people who have over the last couple of decades developed so much knowledge in how to do this. And I want to play another little audio clip from Philip's interview with Ben Finn on kind of the development team and going forward from there.
Well, I think it's a very interesting time and a very interesting situation. The market looked like it was all sewn up with two programs, Finale and Sibelius. But of course, software does gradually date in a way. User interfaces date and software dates, and things improve. The world improves and computers get faster. And of course, computers change because there are things like, touch screens and this kind of stuff that there weren't originally. So, in a sense, potential appears for radical improvements. And like I say, if we were starting all over again, writing Sibelius from scratch, we would change a few things fundamentally. So, like I say, it's a very interesting situation. So we have effectively the Sibelius development team now working on a whole new program right from scratch. They're obviously the world experts from what I've seen, like from the blog. They're doing an even more elaborately thorough job than we did, in fact, much more thorough job in terms of engraving than we did. I'm sure they'll do an excellent job. And just what will happen at that point, I don't know. Because you'll have three excellent programs jostling for position in what is still quite a niche market, although considerably bigger than when we started, because in a sense we created half the market.
A little bit of hubris there, but that's
right.
That's all right.
That's all right. I think he's earned it.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads us to the thing that we haven't really talked about much yet, and that is the new version of Sibelius, or I don't know even what we're calling it anymore. It's kind of unclear.
The relabeled version of Sibelius.
It is Sibelius 8, or it is the new Sibelius. It seems like they're trying to get rid of the numbers, which I remember Apple trying to do with iPads, and they kind of failed at that. They wanted everybody to just call it the new iPad, and nobody did. And so they even went back to numbers after that. So Philip, as a person who uses this application all day long for your job, what did you think when you checked out the latest edition?
Right, and they had announced in advance really what the new features would be and how they were going to be moving to this whole licensing scheme where you could get either a perpetual license or a subscription, and it's probably not worth getting into the details of that. But basically, in essence, the licenses are becoming time-bound rather than version-bound. And they were saying that was the reason why they were moving away from the version numbers, because if you were on a perpetual license where the software would just update when there was a new version, we wouldn't care if it was called 8.0 or 8.2 or 9.3 or whatever. The same way you update with your a lot of your apps on your smartphone or on your your Facebook app on your smartphone. I don't know what version it's on, 34.1.2 or whatever it is. Nobody knows. It just adds new features and you deal with it. But it's not quite as simple as that, unfortunately, when you're dealing with things like notation software as it exists right now, because one of the things that you have to be able to do is share files with other people that may be on an earlier version. You have to know what version it is that everybody, one of the things that I often do when I'm collaborating on a project and I say, well, what version are you working in? Is it 7, is it 7, is it 6, 7.5, whatever, same thing with Finale. Those versions are not interoperable. You can't save in one and then open it up in the other without being careful. You have to make sure you either export it as a previous version or in some cases actually export it to XML. So you really do have to be careful about that. At the same time, we had been used to these new versions of Sibelius and other programs in the notation software field, Finale and certainly MuseScore, when they move to a new version number, not just a point upgrade, but a new version number, we expect a lot. We have historically expected. I mean, certainly version 6 of Sibelius was just you know, it was a cornucopia of everything from magnetic layout to jazz articulations to improvements to slurs to rewire and on and on and on. And it was just a massive update. And same thing with 7. 7, you know, people still have a lot of passionate feelings about 7. I happen to think 7 is excellent. I would not want to go back to 6. But that, you know, people have their own reasons for not liking the ribbon or whatever. But despite all of that, there were still a number of important improvements that took place in 7. The way text was handled, the fact that it was rewritten completely to take advantage of 64-bit systems. You know, Finale is still 32-bit. Sibelius 7 was 64-bit. The fact that they included this, you know, heavy-duty sound library, 30 or 40 gigabyte sound library. So we were used to these massive upgrades, and then Sibelius 8 really, I think where Avid, to be charitable, I think where they could have done a better job really was to introduce this licensing scheme alongside with a substantial update to Sibelius that really had a lot of those new features. But the fact of the matter is, there's really nothing new in Sibelius 8 other than, you know, here's what's new, and we can tick them off very quickly. There's the annotations feature where you can draw on the screen. If you don't have a tablet PC, then you're basically using the mouse to kind of draw annotations. It's almost like, you know, Microsoft Paint version 1.0, so it's all but impractical. But if you do have a Surface, which I actually have right here, which is nice to have.
Now I gotta ask, did you have that before, or did you just get that for Sibelius?
I actually got it for the staff pad.
Totally worth that. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And so, but so, you know, you can actually pinch to zoom on the screen, and you can use the pen to place notes on the screen, and you can, you know, use the eraser on the pen to erase not only notes but items the way you would, you know, basically functioned as clicking and deleting something on the screen. But to really use Sibelius for anything more than that, you still actually need to use the keyboard. You need to use an input device like a trackpad or a mouse. You certainly need a keypad. I mean, yes, you can use, you know, Sibelius without, you know, by getting around the keypad, but having a keypad is just so much infinitely more useful. So other than that, and, you know, improve, you know, the DPI, the high DPI improvements that they made to accommodate the Windows devices. You know, of course, that was an improvement that was made for Mac, and that was a point release. That was, I think, in 7.1.2 or 7.1.3, and so that was a minor point release where Sibelius for Mac gained, you know, Retina support, and here we are in Sibelius 8 saying, well, this is a major new feature, and so I think a lot of people were feeling like, you know, look, there's really not much there, or not much there to quote, I think, Gertrude Stein, but it's kind of telling actually that you can actually save a Sibelius right now anyway. You can save a Sibelius 8 file as a Sibelius 7. You can save it, just regularly save it. If it doesn't have any of the annotations, you can open it up in 7.5 and it will open. And that kind of shows. I'm not a developer. I'm not, you know, an expert in the way the code is written, but that kind of shows you that the code was not really updated, at least at the file format level. So I think, you know, there are so many things that Sibelius and Finale and a lot of these other programs could stand to gain, could stand to update. And I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, the Sibelius development team or the marketing team at the time encouraged users to go on this IdeaScale site to submit. I think it's Sibelius.ideascale.com, and there's like upwards of 600 feature suggestions, and you can vote on them and comment on them, and a lot of them rise to the top, and a lot of them are really good suggestions. and they said, yes, we're going to take these into account, and we will, consider these. But there's nothing, not one of those features. Well, I shouldn't say not one. I think there are a couple that, like, people wanted a bigger keypad, and the keypad icon was refreshed. But these are things that could really help the usability of the software, and they're not there. At least they're not there yet. And so to tout the licensing scheme as a new feature of a reason that you should upgrade, I think was a misfire, unfortunately. And I don't know what Finale's plans were beforehand, but we do know now that Finale is going to come out with 2014.5. Interestingly enough, that's what they're calling it. But they have also said that it's going to be a free upgrade, and we don't know exactly what's going to be, or free update. We don't know exactly what's going to be in it, but they have hinted at some support for the Surface, some updates to handwritten fonts, and some other things. So we'll wait and see exactly what comes out. But I think it's a lot easier to be charitable about minor updates when you're not also at the same time being forced into some other unfamiliar pricing and licensing scheme. So yeah, that's kind of where a lot of the chatter has gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest frustration that I have with it is that it's not just a point release. Like, there's really nothing here that couldn't have, with the possible exception of the annotations, could not have been done as a 7.5 point something.
Right. And to be fair, I mean, 7.5.1 is very stable. It certainly crashes far less, or hardly at all, compared to some of the earlier Sibelius releases. And that is one thing I think we should be fair, and the new developers that are working on it, to have a fresh set of eyes on something, to clean up a lot of that stuff, a lot of the code base. Going back several versions, they did do a very good job of that, and that is important. I mean, when you're working, the last thing you want is to be interrupted, every hour by the program crashing, and you have to restart. So it's important work that they did, and I don't want to necessarily just bash them or I want to be sure to give that credit, because it is important. But at the same time, for better or for worse. I mean, it's funny. People always say, "Fix the bugs, fix the bugs." Well, they did. They did fix the bugs, and now people are complaining. We want new features. We want new features. So, it's we're a little bit to blame here in terms of us being the users at the same time, because it is very stable, and that's important. But yes, there isn't much in the way that you could. It's hard to sell. It's hard to sell the software and then sell the software again, saying, "Well, now we fixed all the problems in it, so we're going to pay, make you pay for it." So
right.
When theoretically it should have been that way the first time. So,
right, and to me, it feels kind of incomplete, and there are a lot of things that they kind of seem to have forgotten about. One of the things that really surprised me when I opened it up the first time is when you get the little splash thing, and it's introduction to the new features. Stuff, and it's like, what's new? And so I click the what's new in Sibelius thing, and I'm taken to a web page that has Daniel Spreadbury saying, "Here's what's new in Sibelius 7." Which is 4 years old now, and Daniel hasn't worked at Sibelius in 3 years.
I think that's the most telling thing.
Right. Yeah, it's
and he's talking about jazz articulations, which you're talking about from Sibelius 6.
Right, that's right. And it's there are other parts of the way it was rolled out that it shows you that there isn't that it doesn't appear that there is the the man hours that can kind of get all those things together. I mean, look, I've spoken with Sam Butler, with Joe Pearson, with some of the other Avid folks, and they're working really hard, and like everybody else is, but it does, the optics of it, I will agree, they don't look good for the average user who isn't following this sort of thing very closely, like some of us are, and they just want to know, oh, it's Sibelius 8, I have to pay an upgrade, what's new, what am I going to get? And then they kind of start, they start seeing things, And I mean, we could go into the many details of things that could be improved. I mean, everything from having a voiced parts feature like Finale has, or even in reverse, where you could potentially write out all the parts in on one staff and somehow have the score combine the intelligently combine the parts. That would be a Sibelius 8 worthy feature, certainly. Certainly the ability to have intelligently group instruments the way that nested groups the way Finale can, to have multiple staff sizes. More than just, you can only really have 2 staff sizes in a Sibelius document at any one time, a small staff size and a regular staff size. Wouldn't it be great if you could have on one page where there was a lot of music on the page, just have that particular page be at a slightly smaller staff size, the way you can reduce a page size in Finale. Things like automatic rest collision avoidance, automatic floating rest. I mean, why do we need a plugin for rests to float underneath beamed notes? I mean, don't get me started on tuplets. I mean, tuplets is a whole other
Copying and pasting with tuplets is one of the most frustrating experiences of my Sibelius user career.
Yeah, and yet, so these are all things that we know that are. These are basically things that are problems in the software that could be improved. Any one, or maybe not any one, but any handful of these things, I think, would be welcomed with open arms. Not to mention some of the things that we don't even know that we wanted or needed. But I think what was really crucial in some of the heyday of Sibelius development was like things that were visionary, things like magnetic layout. Which, it's funny, Daniel actually relayed a similar story where they had been working on magnetic layout for months and months, and finally got a chance to actually see it in action after dealing with all the code. And it was a similar story to that clip that you talked about where Ben was printing out the music and seeing it for the first time. I mean, yes, I think some people would have thought, oh yeah, it would be great if everything could avoid each other, but that wasn't. People weren't clamoring for that, and yet that was something that really totally revolutionized how you use Sibelius. Another one for those of us that are in the film music world or doing orchestrations is Rewire. I had no idea that Rewire existed at the time, and then it certainly would have not been on my top 10 or 20 or top 50 feature requests. But having introduced it. Was a total game changer once I kind of got my head around how it works. The fact that you can start playback in a sequencer and have Sibelius act as a slave to it. I recently did a demonstration at a workshop, at a film scoring workshop at NYU, NYU ASCAP film scoring workshop, and I was talking about music prep in both Sibelius and Finale, and really showing how to do things in both programs. And then I got to show Rewire, and then of course the folks in the class that used Finale, they said, well, can you show us how to do that in Finale? I said, you can't do it in Finale, and it doesn't support it. And they were bummed because their film score, they're film scorers, and it was very useful. So it's that type of thing. It's like, there was an element of the Apple and the Wayne Gretzky idea of skating to where the puck is going to be and not where it's been, that I think Sibelius was really good at pushing. And to be fair, Finale had some feature. I mean, Finale I think was first with the voiced parts, certainly the linked parts and the voiced parts feature. Whether they had the idea first or not, I can't remember, but I think they were first with the released, or I mean, they both came out around the same.
That was a pretty amazing feature.
Yeah,
I remember when that came out. That really changed a lot of things for the way it worked.
Yeah.
I want to say Sibelius had it first, but they were, like you said, it was pretty bang bang.
It was, yeah, it was, and a number of other things. So those are the types of things that I think. But even so, like, I don't even know like what those things would be now, because if I did, then we would be talking about them. Yeah.
Right.
But even just some of the things that are on the idea scale that the consensus of the community would be really nice to have, we haven't seen yet, and I think that's where some of the frustration is.
Yeah. Well, and certainly we all have our frustrations, but it is still, I think, and I was trying to explain this to some friends because I don't want to go into this because this is the Philip Rothman interview and not the Dave McDonald shouting time. I had a bit of an experience with Sibelius and Avid this week, and I wrote a post about it, and we'll link to it in the show notes as well. But the the thing that I kind of tried to point out in that, and that I pointed out to a few people who I spoke with, is that if you're, especially if you're using a Mac, if you are coming from 7 or 7.5, then it's probably not worth you jumping into the new licensing scheme. But if you're coming from an earlier version, there's enough new good stuff that was new in 7 and 7.5 that jumping into this new one, especially depending on what you're doing, could totally be worth the new upgrade. But for me, if you've already got 7.5 or even 7, then there may not be anything here for you.
Yeah. I'm wondering, do institutions sort of have, if they've got money to spend, do they have sort of an obligatory feeling about upgrading to the most current version of something like that?
Mine doesn't.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, and you know, those of you that actually work at schools or other institutions may know better than I would. You know, I think in terms of as I understand, in terms of an accounting mechanism, subscriptions are different than upgrades, like one-time upgrades. So, you know, one is more like an annual, you know, something that's kind of in your annual budget that you're paying for, and one is more of like I think software and hardware upgrades are like a capital expense, so they are accounted for differently. And I think, as was explained to me, that was part of the reason why they were moving to this, is that to allow organizations to have some flexibility in the way they either accounted for the software purchases or amortized them. I'm not an expert necessarily in that side of the thing, side of the business, but you know, I shouldn't really say with authority how that works, but I think that was some of the reason why these new plans were offered.
That's true, and that could be helpful, because instead of having to, you know, write the right grant or beg the right person for a one thing every couple of years, if I get a single thing that is in the budget, that is always going to be in the budget, then we'll always have the new version. So that could
Right.
be useful.
Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately, you have to plan for that a little bit more in advance. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a Sibelius nerd. I've always been a Finale guy, and when I started using Finale way back, the gold standard of frustration for me was beaming over the bar line. So, does Sibelius beam over the bar line is the question.
It does. In fact, it has for as far as I know, back to the earliest days of it. It beams over the bar line quite easily. It does, you know, things like microtones very easily natively, as opposed to, I'm working on a piece, actually one of those scores, those bound scores that you see behind me, has a lot of microtones in it, but I happen to be working in Finale, and believe me, it's a chore to get microtones. I mean, forget even just playback, we're just talking about strictly notation, where it can, you know, it will take the spacing into account correctly, and you know, transposition to a certain extent. There's a whole bunch of kind of nasty workarounds that you have to get to work. So yeah, I mean, Sibelius does, I mean, things, so, you know, we listed off some of the Sibelius improvements. Certainly Finale has a long way to go in certain respects that Finale does, that Sibelius does really easily, like the beaming over the bar line. We mentioned rewire. Certainly, I mean, my goodness, heaven help you if you have a large piece with lyrics in Finale, because it's, you know, it is really, even with the improvements that were made, I think it was in 2011, to the lyrics tool, it's still, you know, it's just a nightmare to work with a large piece with lyrics.
The lyrics tool is exported as something and then type the lyrics in some sort of graphic program,
Yeah.
so that you can make them look exactly the way you want.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. Certainly, just a lot of the tool-based stuff, I think, in Finale. Certainly, dealing with the chord symbols, dealing with, it'd be nice to be able to have different font sizes in both the score and the parts, the way Sibelius does. Certainly, something like magnetic layout would be nice in Finale. Certainly, articulations could be, hugely improved. The way that in Sibelius, you just kind of enter in your articulations, and they just stack on top of each other very neatly, and you don't have to think about it. Finale, you really...
It's a hot mess.
It is. It really is. Tremolos in Finale. I mean, luckily we have Yari Williamson, who writes these wonderful plugins for Finale that has addressed a lot of these things, like his Yada. If you don't know the Yada Yada Tremolo plugin, that is one that it's a Seinfeld type plugin, as he says, and it fixes tremolos, yada 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 yada. And literally, you just run it, and it makes the tremolos look the way they should. He extends the beat, he extends the stems. He will flip the tremolo on the whole note so that it actually positions correctly on the whole note and all that stuff.
That's awesome. I've spent a lot of time looking at my Finale scores at like 375% magnification and click, 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 and position, position, position for hours and hours and hours at a time. So.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, the plugins are really amazing. Those are free. Although if you use any of Yari's plugins, I'd encourage you to donate on his page, because he really does a lot of work. But even things like, finally, we do have in Finale 2014, we have the ability to have a keyless, a truly atonal score, and to have, like, if you have horns and trumpets that you want to have not have a key signature, but you want your other instruments to have a key signature, you can do that properly in Finale 2014, whereas before you had to the result was all these kind of crazy workarounds, as you know. So that was an improvement. But there's a lot, still that we can. But you can't, like, if you're in a transposing score in Finale and you enter in music, say in the B flat clarinet part, and you're playing in your keyboard, you're actually hearing. You're not hearing the You're hearing you're entering in what is the written pitch, but you're also hearing what that pitch is when you should be actually hearing it a step lower. So there's kind of like a cognitive dissonance that's happening between the entry and what you're seeing on the screen if you're used to working in transposing score in Finale. So it's those types of things that I think would be nice to have.
The Finale 2014 thing that has impressed me most is what you said. No key signature is not the same thing as C major Finale.
I'm sure you tell your students that quite often. One of the things that I'll always get in both programs, quite honestly, is that somebody will be working concert pitch, and then you have to do the parts, and you get, like, the clarinet has two sharps and the horn has a sharp, but it's not C major, and so we have to. That's one of the very first things that we do is always make sure that we're changing it to a true, unless it is truly C major, of course, in which we wouldn't do that. Yeah, but in terms, I want to talk about the plugins too for a moment, and some of these other things that are available, because Avid, with this whole thing, they have this whole thing with the Avid Marketplace, and they have way that you could store your files online and get plugins and all that. And we haven't seen that in Sibelius, and quite honestly, I don't know if that is part of their larger plan. But I feel like there is an opportunity for them to bring a lot of these plugins into the program. Like, you can install plugins. That would be great. It would be great. You can install. Starting in Sibelius 7, you can install plugins, directly in the program by going to the file menu and choosing them. Yeah. But these plugin developers, if you're going to offer up a plugin for Sibelius, you have to make it free. You're not, and unless you want to not offer it through their download page, in which case you can offer it as a paid plugin, like Roman Molino Dunn, the music transcriber, has some plugins, and some other people do that. But what if Avid created the App Store?
Like an App Store.
An App Store, exactly. And you could buy a plugin for $1, and
it follows you through your Sibelius install.
Yeah, exactly. And the plugin developer would get 70% of that, and the Avid would get 30%. Everybody would be happy. I think plugin developers would write more plugins. I mean, luckily we
Sure.
have.
And they'd be able to make money, like you said. Like the difference for me as a user between free and 99 cents is almost negligible, but for a few hundred people, that could be pretty significant for somebody writing the plugin.
Yeah,
Sure.
and plus, like, you know what all plugins you've been using, because unless you keep a list, you might forget. And to you, it becomes a part of the program. You know, you're not thinking I'm using this plugin. You're just thinking
Right.
this is the way the program works for me now. And just like the Google Play Store, you know, it says you've downloaded this and this and this and this when you change phones. The same kind of thing. And like Dave said,
Yeah, that's how it is on my Mac. Like there's some applications on my Mac that are just like part of how I use the Mac. And when I set up a new one, like it's not a useful tool to me until I've got at least like 15 things installed.
And plus, that store could tell you things like this plugin isn't supported in the newest version of Sibelius or whatever.
Sure.
And so you know whether or not, and that might actually be a decision maker for you as to whether or not you're going to, you know, change versions or whatever.
Right, and not, you know, not even, you know, we don't have to stop at plugins. Even think about some of the other things like sound sets that are available for Sibelius. That you know, Jonathan Loving, he hasn't done too much recently, but there are these sound sets that, you know, enable you to use you know, other sound libraries like Vienna or East West or Hollywood Strings or Cine Strings or all these other things, and he sells them. But it's a third-party website. You have to go. You have to know how to install it, which folders to install it in, and all this stuff. And people don't really know about it. Or something like Note Performer, which is a great thing for Sibelius, made by Wallander Instruments, and it's kind of a plug-and-play type of thing. But again, you have to know, you know, through the forums or through some other source that you know, it exists. You have to go to his website, set up an account with him, you know, pay, download it as a disk image. And what if, you know, that was right in Sibelius, like add-on playback options through Sibelius, and for $129, you know, you buy that through your, yeah. So I think there, I mean, you know, there's a lot of potential, and I don't, you know, for all I know, maybe Avid is planning on doing this at some point, but that would be another actually very significant upgrade, because I think people it has been shown that people are willing to pay for these things that really enhance their usability of the product. But a lot of people simply don't know about them because they have to go somewhere else, and there's a convoluted download process and all that. And if it was right there in the software, I think that would be a place where Avid could make some money and also help the developer community make money. And I think people, you know, users would actually be more than happy to know that their money was going primarily to the developers, and Avid takes a cut, and they're encouraging, you know, third-party enhancement of the software. So there's a lot of potential there, and I would like to see, and there's no reason really why Finale couldn't do the same thing as well. I mean, I just don't know really the development side of it, what it takes to implement that sort of thing. I'm sure it's not trivial, but it would I think help, you know, the community of users enhance their usability.
Yeah.
And I think it's exactly the sort of improvement that could actually be unique to having the Avid developers as opposed to the previous Sibelius team, because that's the thing that those guys are experts in.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, some free ideas for Avid. You're welcome.
No charge.
Right.
You know, we've been nerding out over engraving, but you do more than just write the Sibelius blog. You run NYC Music Services, and as a way to pivot to that, I see Dave and I were commenting earlier, we see something in the background there that as composers we highly covet, and while people might think it's the keyboard, no, it's that giant, it's the air conditioner, no, I'm just kidding, it's the giant, awesome-looking printer. So
we're in the South, though, so the air conditioner is actually kind of nice, too.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Well,
tell us about that printer, because
Sure.
Dave and I both covet it without even seeing its specs yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, very briefly, I mean, you mentioned the Sibelius blog, and that was something that Daniel Spreadbury started as an independent venture while he was still working at Sibelius, and when everything changed in 2012, he got a hold of me and said, look, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for me to continue this, but would you have any interest in this? And at that point I said, oh sure, I'd be interested in, there's a wealth of information. I said, I'll pay the hosting bill, I'll keep the lights on and see where it goes. And over time it is, but it's not affiliated obviously with Avid, and I've kind of made it part of my business, which is NYC Music Services, and I cover a variety of things, not only Sibelius related, but other programs, other tech news as well. So that's kind of how that worked. And then yes, with the business that I do, I do a lot of composing, a lot of copying and arranging and printing. And there's actually I have another printer that's off camera that's not quite as big, but it can also do up to 18 by 12 duplex and all that good stuff. But this is a
we're going to need some model numbers.
The model number is it's CP6015X. H is an HP. It's a color laser jet. I've had it for about 4 years, and it's great. You can look it up. It's more than a few pennies.
Sure.
But the reason I got it was I was doing a lot of prep for one of my major clients is Carnegie Hall. They have a wonderful education program called Link Up, and they serve 3rd through 5th graders all around the country, actually all around the world, and they have several different shows. It's an hour-long show that they do based on different themes, like the orchestra rocks, the orchestra sings, the orchestra moves, and I was brought in by their resident composer, Tom Cavanis, who had written some pieces for them and kind of was helping them develop the whole show. And they had gotten the program started from their education department, but they were like photocopying the music on their photocopiers, and administrative staff was basically putting music together. And then when the program grew to more than just a couple of orchestras, they really realized that this is not something that you need a proper music prep outfit to do this. So they brought me in, and I started doing all the work on it. And then, but I was still subbing out the printing because I didn't have the proper equipment. And then I realized, wait a second, to really do this right and to have the control over it, I needed a proper high-speed printer that could do that sort of thing. So it's not, there are, companies that have printers that take up entire rooms. This is just one notch short of that, where it's not quite that. But what I do have, and I'll go off screen for a second, but the key element to this, in addition to the printer, is an automatic folding machine, which can run at high speed. I see Sam's eyes. So it's back there. And I wonder if I could, maybe I'll give you a quick demo. Would you be interested in that, of the folding machine?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
absolutely.
For our audio listeners, Philip has stepped away to demonstrate the folding machine.
You put the paper in like so, and
For our listeners, he's putting what looks like 12 by 18, probably, into the folding machine.
That sound was some magic happening inside the folding machine. And it happened very fast. And now we have
folded,
folded sheets.
Yeah, paper. So that was probably one of the more unusual demonstrations you've had on your show, but suffice it to say, it helps make the the process of preparing large quantities of printed music a real breeze. And of course, I have a comb a spiral binding, coil binding machine, and also a electric saddle stapler, and all these things. And when things really ramp up with either the Carnegie project or some other printing projects, I'll bring in some help, and we'll all get together and really knock this stuff out very quickly. So it's a very useful service to provide, not only for my clients, for whom I do the music preparation, but also the word has gotten out, and people just come to me straight, for straight printing work, where they'll, they have done all their own copying, and they send me PDFs, and I will drop ship it really anywhere in the world, quite honestly.
But the blog has helped out with that.
Yeah, it's nice. I mean, the blog, certainly, I've met a lot of really nice people on the blog. I mean, the level of comments and feedback on the blog, I feel, is very high. A lot of really thoughtful, people reading, commenting on it, sharing it, and it's nice. It's, especially because I do spend most of my day just, really by myself working on these things, but yet I'm in constant contact with a lot of people. So that's a nice, it's a nice virtual community.
Yeah. One thing that we have talked about on the show before is Daniel Spreadbury's new music font that he created for Steinberg and the new font standard that goes with it. And you have on NYC Music Services a Sibelius-friendly version of it, which I used on a recent score, and I think it looks beautiful.
Oh, great. Well, it's funny. I've now started to see it out in the wild a little bit, which is nice. It was certainly an idea. There was an early version of it called Tanayev that somebody named Andrew Moshow had made. He's in Australia, but it hadn't really gotten to the point where you could really use it professionally, because it was very much an earlier version. But it got me thinking, like, what if we could actually develop a font that you could, that was the Bravura font, but used in Sibelius, and certainly I would, I'm sure you'll link to your previous interview with Daniel, because he talks about Smoofle and all these things, and why, why there was a need for the font standard, because every program had its own different font mapping standard, and so he talks about that. And
you had to translate all of that.
Yeah, you have to translate. So that's why, and as far as I know, Sibelius is not going to be supporting Smoofle anytime soon. Finale will be, and they have said publicly that they will be supporting the Smoofle standard, which is great. MuseScore does now as well, and a number of other programs, the newer programs certainly, like Bravura, like StaffPad and some other things. But Sibelius is still Sibelius. There are, I don't know, 8 or 9 different fonts that you have to install for all these different symbols. So I'd love to use this font. And then I enlisted a very talented engraver by the name of Matthew Maslanka to really do. He really did, basically all the heavy lifting of porting all the symbols from Bravura, which is one font, into the various versions of what we call Norfolk, because that was the Norfolk, Connecticut was where Sibelius's one visit to the United States was, and so we named it after that. And then we kind of just started testing it, and we got and of course part of the license is that I can't sell that font commercially. Right. And look, what I could have done is just kind of kept it for myself and said, well, I put the money and time investing into developing this font, but I don't want anybody else to have it. But first of all, it wouldn't have been as good if I didn't have other people's feedback. And second of all, I think it's great to kind of have it out there as something that people can use and make their scores more beautiful and have another option. So it's been a fun project, and I know that it's been downloaded more than 1,000 times at this point, which is not to mention however many people have shared it, not downloading directly from the website. So it was a nice. I'm glad we did it, and I'm glad you're using it. I'm glad I've been able to use it on a number of scores now.
It's really great. The last piece that I did, I engraved for iPad screen first instead of paper, and the broader strokes throughout Bravura are really good for that.
Right.
You're not sure exactly how large it's going to be scaled when the person actually uses it. So it's the font was really great for that, and it was really easy to drop it in and start using right away. So thank you for that. And we should probably wrap up. We've been going way longer than we normally go because we've had so much fun talking to you. But I did want to mention just a few things, just a few headlines, and I'm really not even going to talk about these because we're going a little long, but there's a great Kickstarter project that some people may be interested in. It is called The Earth Moves. It's a documentary about Einstein on the Beach, about the history of productions of Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass. The video on Kickstarter makes this thing look like it's going to be kind of the definitive work on the documentary. He's got a lot of really good footage already, and there's not been a lot of really good, solid documentary of the opera itself, which is very much a visual thing. I really did not care for it when I was in school because I had only heard audio recordings of it, but when I saw a production of it, completely changed my opinion of it. And so it's really important that these kinds of things get documented because it's such a massive undertaking that it doesn't get presented very often. So check that out on Kickstarter as this publishes at the beginning or at the end of June. There's just less than a week left. So if you're interested, get on that quick. There is a really interesting news story this week out of Boston. The Boston Conservatory and the Berklee College of Music are looking at a merger, which is really interesting. The Berklee College of Music obviously focuses on jazz and popular music. The Boston Conservatory not. The Boston Conservatory has a pretty large number of students for such an institution, a little over 700, but a much smaller endowment. Their endowment is something like 15 million to 300 something million as the Berklee endowment. But it's interesting because they don't directly compete, right? That one of them is training budding rock musicians and jazz musicians and songwriters, and the other one is training budding classical musicians and dancers and musical theater performers. And so there's a lot of ways that they could work together better and not lose any competition because they weren't really competing for any of the same students to begin with. There's also some news. We spoke about Apple Music launching, and that launch is actually this Tuesday as I'm recording this coming Tuesday, June 30th. And they've had to make some changes. We talked about they're not paying any royalties for the first 3 months of a person's free trial. And a lot of people were upset about that, and you can read a lot more detail about that. But the short version of this story is on this past Sunday morning, shortly before we started recording our episode last week, Taylor Swift wrote a Tumblr blog post, kind of an open letter to Apple and Tim Cook about why she did not think that this was fair and that she was very angry and upset about it, and that people who were making us think about it were right to be making us think about it. Later that same night, so that post went up in the United States on Sunday morning. I think Swift was touring in Europe at the time, so the time zones were weird. But that went up on Sunday morning in the U.S. That night, Eddie Q of Apple tweeted that they were changing their tune and he and Phil Schiller called a bunch of, those are two Apple executives. If you're not a nerd, you don't know all the Apple exec names. Eddie Q and Phil Schiller called a bunch of journalists and said, yep, we're changing things. And so they're paying not the same rate that they would pay. They're paying less, but they are paying something, and that is good enough for a lot of people. They've brought on two major independent record label groups, Merlin and Beggars Group, and they've also brought in Taylor Swift, and she has also announced that Apple Music will be the first streaming service that will have complete access to her new album, 1989, which she famously pulled from the big streaming services last year, which means that I will get to hear it for the first time because I don't listen to anything that I can't get easily on a streaming service because, well, that's not true. Something that I care about as little as I care about Taylor Swift, I will only get from a streaming service. I've purchased other things from independent outlets, but I'll finally get to hear what everybody's talking about. So I won't be such a closeted nerd. So it looks like we lost Sam, but Philip, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure talking with you and Sam both, and I'm sure we could have gone on for many, many more minutes and hours talking about all this stuff. So perhaps we'll talk again in the future.
Indeed, you'd be welcome back to talk about new stuff coming up any time. And we do, of course, also want to give our remembrances to two composers, great composers and musicians we lost this week, just absolute giants in American music. James Horner, film composer, frequent collaborator with filmmaker James Cameron, scored films such as Titanic and Avatar, died in a plane crash at the young age of 60 this past week. And of course, we also lost one of my favorite musicians, Gunther Schuller, the man who coined the term "the third stream" for music that is not quite jazz and is not quite classical and exists in some really interesting and compelling nether region in between the two. He was also a horn player and is the horn player on some of the cuts in some versions of Miles Davis' "Birth of the Cool." So. Gunther Schuller passed away this past Sunday at 89. So two giants. We wish them happy trails, James Horner and Gunther Schuller. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of SoundNotion. Thank you so much for listening. We'll have show notes where you can find links to the things that I rambled through at the end. If you would like more detail than I was able to give in that last 5 minutes, you can find those at soundnotion.tv/SN. You can, if you would like to support the show, the absolute best way to do that is to leave us a review in the iTunes store. You can subscribe to this show and all our shows there in the iTunes store as well as wherever finer podcasts are aggregated for your device. And you can also find all those links on our site. Again, that's soundnotion.tv. If you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like us to discuss or cover, or people that you'd like to hear us interview, send those along as well. You can email us at soundnotiontv@gmail.com, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to take the holiday weekend in the United States off next weekend, and we'll be back July 12th. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you back next week.